Maybe some information that you may not all be familiar with. Some of you may be familiar with it, so just bear with me as we walk through it. We're going to first start by clarifying some of the terminology. When we talk about a PAN and a bin and an IN, what are we talking about? Well, hopefully a PAN is not a new term for you. We're talking about the primary account number. It's assigned to the individual cardholder. The PAN, as you may know, also contains an IN, an IIN. Now, the IIN is the issuer identification number, and this, as it suggests, identifies the institution that issued the card. Now, the PAN and the IN are both part of a standardized global numbering scheme that is defined by an ISO IEC standard. The standard number is 7812-1. ISO is the International Organization for Standardization, and IEC is the International Electrotechnical Commission. And these are the bodies who define the standards that define the formats for PAN, including the IIN. Now, the BIN is the bank identification number, is a subset of the IIN, and is often used interchangeably. The issuer identification number applies to more types of companies than just banks. Other types of companies also issue cards, so they may also have an IIN. In the payments industry, we tend to use BIN because we tend to be referring to the bank-issued card numbers more than anything else. And prior to 2017, both the IN and the BIN were defined as having a fixed length of 6 digits. But this all changed in 2017. Now, why did that change? It changed because the payments industry is growing, and it's growing rapidly. And because of this, there is an increasing number of card issuers who are looking to issue new types of cards. And this is putting pressure on the availability of numbers and the available ranges that are possible for them to use when they're looking at putting in their own bin on a card. So to address this potential shortage of bin numbers, the ISO Standards Organisation, they convened with their industry stakeholders. They held lots of discussions to decide what the best path forward was. And it was agreed then to increase the length of the bin from 6 to 8 digits. And now this update was published in their standard in 2017, in that new ISO standard that I referenced. And that's basically where that came from. Who organises it is the ISO standards. The bin is part of that PAN. But if we're thinking about what does that mean to me, how does that affect me as someone in the payment industry? Well, while 6-digit bins are still predominantly used, and you may find them the most common format, 8-digit bins are already in use also. And these are going to become more prevalent as we move forward. And depending on how your organisation handles PANs and bins and what your role is in processing that payment data, this may or may not have an impact on how you need to configure your systems. Now, for some organisations, this may not have any direct impact at all. For example, there may be merchants who are not affected or who don't need to change their systems because any changes that need to be made will be handled by their payment processor. For example, if a merchant has a payment system that simply transmits all of their payment transactions to the same processor, and that processor then handles the routing, then that's where any changes that need to be made would be made. Another example is if the merchant systems are directly managed by a processor or third-party service provider, then it would be that processor or service provider who would make sure those systems are configured properly. So the merchant itself may not directly need to do anything except work with their third parties. Another example of a merchant who may not need to do anything is if the only access to the PAN that they have, due to their business need, is to just see the last 4 digits. If their business need is purely just to have that as for their files or for their records, the fact that the bin number's changing isn't going to impact that business need. So just seeing those last 4 digits is still all they're going to need to do. There will, however, be some organisations and probably many merchants who may need to look at their configurations, and they might need to make some changes. If a merchant has any business logic built into their systems that is specific to the bin, either the range or the specific numbers in the bin, then this may need to be reviewed and looked at to see if it needs updating. Sometimes as well, the bin is used to determine which third party it is sent to, such as for routing purposes. And these are the types of functions that if the merchant has control of that, they may need to make sure they're updating it. Merchants who basically have their own internally managed, or if they have a proprietary system that they've developed themselves, they would then control that configuration, and they would want to look at how those systems use or don't use the bin as part of its configuration. And this will then determine if they need to review those bin rules. There's also the instances where some system configurations may rely on third-party provided bin tables, or bin numbers could even be hard-coded into the system configuration. And again, this is where we need to look at those numbers to see if they need updating. And as I mentioned before, with the payment processing, there is typically downstream processors or other downstream partners that the transaction information is going to. So it's important also to coordinate with any of those downstream partners to see how they are managing 8-digit bin formats, because obviously if you're transmitting data to each other, you need to make sure you're supporting the same formats. Now, from a PCI standards perspective, all of the PCI standards support the use of 8-digit bins as far as meeting the requirements in that standard. Many, not all, many PCI standards have some requirements for truncation or masking to protect the PAN. Two examples are PCI DSS and the PTS POI standard. Now, masking and truncation are not the same. They both apply to PAN, they are specific to PAN in the PCI standards, but they do have different applicability and they do have a different effect on the PAN. And we're just going to do a quick recap of that so that it's clear. We're going to start with truncation. This is a very technical example, as you can see. Truncation is a method of rendering the PAN unreadable by actually removing a segment of the PAN data. Now, the truncation system will typically replace the removed digits with something else. They could be other digits or they could be some form of character. But the main point is that those original digits have been completely removed. Truncation is not reversible, therefore. Because these digits have been removed, they cannot be retained. The cupcakes are gone, for example. We cannot get them back. In order to retain that digit, the PAN itself would need to be recreated from another source. So truncation is used when you won't need to access that full PAN in that instance. If you're retaining it in storage for business or tracking purposes that never require it to be recreated within that source, that's when you use truncation. Now, masking, on the other hand, is used to hide some of the digits of the PAN rather than remove them. So when you're masking it, you're actually concealing some of those digits. The full PAN itself, though, still exists somewhere. You're just hiding those digits from view so that they cannot be seen. And for this reason, masking is temporary. The full PAN is secure, hopefully securely stored somewhere else, but what you're looking at on a particular screen or an application or on a resource is just the version that has some of those numbers hidden. But because the full PAN is still there, the configuration could always be changed to show a different format, including potentially showing the full PAN again. So masking is used when you're looking at identifying the right number of digits that need to be shown to a particular role or a resource or a type of application, but based on having the full PAN securely stored somewhere else in your environment. Now, from a PCI DSS perspective, as with the other standards, PCI DSS does support 8-digit bin ranges in both its masking and truncation requirements. In fact, it doesn't restrict any bin ranges. The masking requirement in PCI DSS did change slightly between version 3.2.1 and version 4. For version 3.2.1, the baseline masking format in PCI DSS was to display up until the first 6 and last 4 digits. And in version 4 of the standard, it was changed to display up to the bin and the last 4 digits of the PAN. And that's just the baseline format for masking. Now, both versions of the standard do support formats that display more digits than those baseline formats. It just requires that there is a documented business need as to why those extra digits need to be displayed, to explain why the particular role or person or system needs to see more than that baseline format. The key point of the requirement in DSS is that whatever masking approach is used, it displays only the number of digits that are needed to serve that business need. If only the last 4 digits are needed, per that earlier example, then only show those last 4 digits. If the business need is to have the bin available in order to make, for example, a routing decision, then that's the only part of the PAN that needs to be displayed as well. Now, from a truncation perspective in PCI DSS, the truncation requirement is relevant to the requirement about rendering PAN unreadable when it is stored. And this is designed to prevent anyone who has unauthorized access to a system from actually gaining access to the stored PANs on that system. let's say someone compromises a system, they exploit a vulnerability, or they get into the system by bypassing the access controls. Because the truncation process has removed some of those PAN digits, that attacker cannot retrieve the full PAN from that system. The full PAN no longer exists on that system. So they won't be able to recover the full PAN. And this is the purpose of truncation. Now, the truncation formats themselves are not defined in the standard. Each different card brand has a different PAN and IN and BIN structure. So the formats for truncation are defined by the individual payment brands. And for that reason, we don't put them in the standard because they may evolve and they may differ by brand. We actually cover that information in a frequently asked question on our website. The FAQ in question is 1091. You may be very familiar with this FAQ. It has been around for quite a long time and it has been updated fairly recently, but it was actually updated in 2017 to incorporate allowance that 8-digit bins may need a different truncation format. We've updated it a few times since 2017 as well. And it was updated again, as I said, a few months back, fairly recently. I think was the last time it was updated. The important note from this FAQ is that the formats that it identifies are the maximum number of digits that are permitted to be retained where there is a business need to do so. If you don't have a business need to retain that maximum number of digits, then don't. Remove more digits so you're not keeping as many. Because the more digits that you're retaining, obviously that could potentially expose more of the PAN to risk, allowing an attacker to more easily retrieve the full PAN. We also have another FAQ, it's 1492, and this one provides specific guidance on how PCI DSS requirements for masking and truncation, how they can apply when you have 8-digit bins in your environment. And the key point for this FAQ is that whichever format is used, the truncation and masking format should always be the minimum that's needed for a specific business need. It's therefore really important that you know what your business need is for each instance where you're storing PAN or where you're keeping PAN going through your payment process. And also, just because these increased formats have been provided to support those business needs where they are needed, it doesn't mean you should automatically jump to showing those maximum number of digits. Start using the extended format just because they're allowed to support those needs. Use the format that really meets your own business need. Now, when you are looking at your truncation formats for all the PAN that you have in your environment, as well as confirming that each system or each instance is conforming to the right format, you also need to consider where you have more than one system applying a truncation format, the potential for a cumulative impact that may have on your overarching truncation. Now, if you do have, for example, different systems applying different formats, you may find that more digits than intended are exposed overall, and this could impact the security of that PAN storage. And just to show you an example of what that looks like, let's say we have an original PAN. It's a very interesting, straightforward PAN. We have a system that truncates the first 8 and last 4 digits of that PAN. Sorry, it truncates the middle, so the first 8 and the last 4 are available. Another system allows the first 10 and the last 2 to be available. Now, both of those formats may support that particular format allowance for that particular PAN type, but when they're both in the same environment, the cumulative impact is that the first 10 and last 4 digits are now exposed. So you can see that this is really going to increase the number of overall digits that are exposed. It's easier for the full PAN to be reconstructed from this, and it's going to really reduce the security value of implementing those truncation formats because the cumulative effect of that is basically undermining that security that was implemented. And then we have a scenario like this, and we do have this guidance in the FAQ as well. It's important that you have controls in place to ensure that the different truncation versions can't be correlated somehow, so that these extra digits can't be reconstructed. And if you're using truncation as a means to reduce scope of applicability of other PCI DSS requirements, then this is also really important, because if you have these extra if you have the potential for this correlation, you need to make sure that those controls are properly verified so that that correlation cannot take place and those extra digits can't be combined, so that you don't have any more than the maximum allowable number of digits in your environment. Otherwise, you can no longer consider that PAN out of scope. If you're looking for where to begin with your environment on how to find out what you have, the first recommendation is, of course, don't put it off. 8-digit bins have been known about since 2017, but they're really starting to ramp up now. So it's good to be proactive and get ahead of any things that might come up. And the first step in knowing how the introduction of 8-digit bins might affect you is to know exactly how you're using PAN. And that means examining all your flows of payment data throughout your environment. How many digits of PAN you need to retain for each step of that process or each usage of that data. This also includes working with your business partners, your acquirers, your downstream processors, as I mentioned, possibly some third-party vendors, and any other third parties that you work with or that are involved in your transaction process to see how they are handling their formats of PAN. Once you've done this, you can then identify and implement the right formats that are best for your organisation, that support your business needs while exposing the minimum number of digits. And don't forget to confirm any of those cumulative impacts that might appear. If you do have different business needs on different systems, that the cumulative result of that doesn't result in more exposure than you intended. And of course, document it. It's very helpful to have documented all the instances of PAN, all the truncation formats, all the masking formats that you use, and then you can put next to that the business reason as to why those formats are needed. And that will help you, of course, when it comes to verifying those for the assessment, as well as just making sure that, again, you haven't inadvertently exposed more PAN digits than you intended. Now, looking at the PTS POI standard as another example, with the introduction of 8-digit bins, we have had quite a few POI vendors and some of the users of the POI systems asking whether the POI payment terminals, the payment devices that are approved to that PTS standard, whether they are allowed to implement truncation methods that exceed the first 6 and last 4, which was always the traditionally defined truncation format, in order to support PANs with 8-digit bin. And of course, yes, of course, the PTS standard does support different truncation formats to support 8-digit bins. The actual requirement that applies to this in the standard was updated in version 6.1 of the standard, and that allows the support of different formats as defined by those FAQs that contain the brand allowances for each type of PAN. We also, in that FAQ, clarified that devices that are validated to earlier versions of the standard, so version 6.1 was the current version, is the current version at the time, but devices validated to version 3 or 4 or 5 of the standard can also use that testing guidance and the testing process that's in version 6 of the standard to verify that the truncation format is acceptable, and that also supports the different formats for 8-digit bins. So this means whichever version of the standard a POI device is validated to, there is a process for the vendors to configure those devices and put that through for validation to support 8-digit bins. Now, if you're a POI vendor and you're wondering what the next step is, as I said, all versions of the standard, so whichever version your device is validated to, I encourage you to look at the technical FAQ, the frequently asked question document for that version of the standard. They each have been updated to include the relevant information with respect to formats and 8-digit bins, and follow the PTS process as defined in the program guide for submitting delta changes. If you need to make a configuration change to your listed devices for the different truncation formats, you can do that through the delta process that's covered under the program guide. If you're looking for more information on 8-digit bins generally, we do have some resources on our website that may also help you. On our general FAQ page, I looked at 2 FAQs really briefly. We do have some more that cover bin ranges and truncation and masking generally. If you do a search for bin or truncation or masking, you'll get a bunch of those. We also published a blog post a little while ago that provides a bit of an introduction to 8-digit bins and some of the things that you might like to consider. And if you're looking for guidance specific to a particular standard, this is where also you can find those technical FAQs for standards like the PTS POI. And for PCI DSS, we have that guidance column, and there's a lot of information in that for all requirements, but for both the truncation and the masking requirement in particular, there's some extra guidance in there with respect to bin ranges too. So if I'm trying to summarise what 8-digit bins mean, the answer is really, in order to understand what it means to a particular company or how it may impact your environment, you first need to understand the purpose that you're using PAN for, and therefore your business need for how much you need to retain of that PAN at each step of that process. The main goal is to ensure that only the minimum number of digits are displayed or retained as needed for the specific business need at the time. And remember that your current truncation format that you use may still meet your needs going forward. The introduction of 8-digit bins may not require that you change anything. It really depends on how you're using the PAN and what you need to see, what you need to retain. And again, this isn't something that you don't do in isolation by yourself. Talk to your processing partners, see, and understand how they're managing any changes. They might be able to help you manage any changes that you're working with them on in your own environment. And again, for information about PCI standards, refer to the FAQs or the specific technical FAQs in our standards and on our website for some more information. And if you still don't find the answer that you need, come and ask us. We want to know what questions you have. If you have a question about a particular standard, we can certainly help put you in touch with the owner of that standard, the subject matter expert in that topic. If it's general information, we can certainly help provide some more guidance through our FAQs as well. So if you do have questions and you can't find the answer there, please come and find us. Hopefully you all know how to contact us. We don't have a lot of time left today for mingling in the vendor showcase. So if you have a question, then do reach out. But hopefully that helps you understand a bit of where to go next with 8-digit bins. So thank you.